Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to StoryForge Network. I didn't plan to tell this story. Not like this, not in public. But some memories grow heavy when you keep them locked inside, and mine have been pressing against my ribs for years. The day my parents walked out of that hospital room is a day I still measure time against, like there's a before and an after, and everything I am now lives in the echo of that hallway. I remember the smell first, that clean, sharp hospital smell that never quite covers the fear, and the way the ceiling tiles looked like they were drifting, as if I were underwater. I remember thinking I must be dreaming because my mother's shoes were pointed toward the door, not toward me, and my father wouldn't meet my eyes. They said they had to go. They said my sister needed them. They didn't say goodbye. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I should start where I still felt like I belonged somewhere. I grew up in a small, careful house where everything had its place, including us. My sister Leela was older by 2 years and brighter by a mile, or at least that's how it felt. She had a laugh that filled rooms and a way of making adults lean in like she carried a spotlight inside her chest. I was the quieter one, the kid who folded into corners and read too much, the one teachers described as thoughtful, which is a polite way of saying invisible. Our parents weren't cruel. They were busy, tired, trying, and they loved us in the way people love when they're afraid of messing up and end up following the path of least resistance. The path usually curved toward Leela because Leela made noise. I learned early that silence is easy to step over. Grandma Ruth was the exception. She lived in a little house at the end of our street with a porch that sagged like a tired smile and wind chimes that rang even when there wasn't any wind. She had hands that smelled like flour and peppermint and a voice that could soften hard things. She saw me in the way people sometimes see past the obvious and into the waiting. When Leela and I were small, Grandma would split cookies exactly in half and then slide an extra crumb onto my side like a secret. She never said why. She didn't need to. She was the only one who noticed when I came home quiet instead of quiet, if that makes sense, when my silence had weight. The year everything went wrong started like any other. I was 16 and working part-time at a bookstore after school, saving for a used car that I pretended I didn't care about but counted every shift toward. Leela was 18 and on the edge of leaving, or so she said, talking about auditions in cities with names that felt like doors opening. At home, the air was thin with anticipation and small arguments about dishes and rides and who left the lights on. Nothing felt like it could break us because nothing ever had. That's the trick of families. You think the pattern will hold because it always has. The night of the accident was rainy, the kind of rain that turns the world into a mirror and makes every street light look like a star you could step on. Leela and I were supposed to be home, but she asked me to cover for her while she met a friend. It wasn't unusual. I said yes because saying no would have been a fight, and I was tired. I stayed up reading and half watching the clock. When the phone rang, it sounded like a dropped plate. My mother answered and sat down like someone had taken her bones away. The words came out wrong, tangled, and then they were gone, both of them, leaving the front door swinging. I didn't see Leela that night. I didn't see her the next morning either. I woke up to a headache that felt like a nail behind my eyes and a room that wouldn't stop tilting. By noon, I was shaking and my vision had gone grainy, like a bad photograph. Grandma came over because my mother hadn't come back and because Grandma always noticed when the house got too quiet. She took one look at me and said we were going to the hospital, no arguing, and wrapped me in a sweater even though it was warm. In the car, she kept one hand on the wheel and one on my knee like she was anchoring me to the road. They said it was dehydration and exhaustion and a fever that had spiked. They said it would be okay with fluids and rest. They said a lot of calm things. I slept and woke and slept again, drifting in and out of a white room with a curtain that hissed when nurses pulled it closed. I asked for my parents. Someone said they were on their way. I believed that because belief is easier when you're weak. When they came, they didn't come alone. Leela was with them, a bandage on her arm like a small white flag. She looked pale and dramatic and carefully hurt. My mother's face was set in a way I didn't recognize, like she'd chosen a mask and forgotten how to take it off. My father stood behind her, hands in his pockets, eyes on the floor. Leela started talking before anyone asked her to. She talked about the rain and the car and the way everything happened too fast. She said she'd gone out because I'd told her she needed space and she didn't want to fight. She said she'd been so upset that she couldn't think straight. She said when the police asked questions, she told them the truth, which was that she'd been driving because I'd insisted she take me somewhere and then panicked and grabbed the wheel. I remembered the room going quiet, not the soft hospital quiet, but the kind that presses. I tried to sit up and couldn't. I tried to speak and my throat made a small, useless sound. My mother's eyes snapped to me like a door slamming. "Is that true?" she asked, and it felt like a test I hadn't studied for because the questions were wrong. I shook my head. My father finally looked up, and in his eyes I saw something like relief, which I didn't understand yet. Leela's voice got thinner, sharper. She said I always hated attention, that I always hid things, that I told her not to tell anyone. She said I'd begged her to switch seats because I was scared. None of it was true, but lies have a way of finding shapes people already believe. They didn't ask me again, or maybe they did and I couldn't hear it over the rush of my own pulse. They stepped out into the hallway and the door closed, and I lay there staring at a stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of somewhere I'd never go. When they came back, my mother didn't touch me. My father spoke like he was reading instructions. They said Leela needed them. They said this was a lot. They said we'd talk later. They said I should rest. Then they left. I wish I could tell you I shouted or cried or threw something. I didn't. I lay there and listened to the cartwheels squeak past and thought about how the stain on the ceiling looked like a bird if you squinted. I thought about Grandma's wind chimes and how they rang even when there wasn't any wind. I wondered if this was what falling through a floor felt like. Grandma came back that evening. She came in with a paper bag of things I didn't need and a face that was already angry. She asked where my parents were. I told her. I tried to make it sound smaller than it was. She sat down and took my hand and said, "They don't get to do that," like it was a promise she intended to keep. Then she told me something that turned the room right side up and upside down at the same time. She said she'd been at the intersection that night, walking home from the pharmacy because her car was in the shop. She said she'd seen the car. She said she'd seen who was in the driver's seat. She said she tried to wave them down, and they'd passed like a shadow. She said she'd given a statement to the police and assumed the truth would land where it belonged. It hadn't, not yet. Lies are faster than old women with grocery bags. I closed my eyes and felt something like heat behind them. Not tears, not exactly, more like the idea of tears. Grandma squeezed my hand. She said, "We'll fix this." I didn't know how, but for the first time that day, I believed someone. She left to get me a blanket I liked from home, the one that smelled like laundry soap in summers, and I slept because my body finally let me. When I woke, the hallway was louder and a nurse was adjusting my IV. My phone buzzed with a message I didn't open. I watched the drip count time and thought about how easily people decide who you are when you're not in the room to argue. They didn't come back that night, or the next morning, or the morning after that. A social worker asked me questions with a soft voice. A doctor told me I could go home soon. Home felt like a word from a language I used to speak. Grandma came every day. She brought stories and fruit and quiet fury. She said the police were reviewing statements. She said some things take longer because they shouldn't. She said Leela wasn't answering her calls. She said my mother had hung up. The day they discharged me, my parents still didn't come. Grandma signed the papers with a hand that shook, and I signed under hers, my name smaller than it had ever been. In the parking lot, the rain started again, and I stood there with my bag of things and tried to understand how a family can decide who is easier to carry and who is easier to set down. If you're wondering whether I hated my sister then, the honest answer is that I didn't have the energy. I felt hollow, like someone had taken the furniture out of my chest and left the rooms echoing. Grandma drove me home to her place instead of ours, and I didn't argue because I didn't know how to argue for a place that didn't seem to want me. That was the beginning. Not the lie itself, but the space it made, the space where everything else would happen. I didn't know yet how loud the truth can be when it finally stands up, or how quiet you can get while you're waiting for it. All I knew was that the ceiling stain still looked like a bird, and birds, when they leave, don't always come back the same way. Grandma's house had always been a soft place, but that week it felt like a bunker built out of quilts and old recipes and stubborn hope. She put me in the room that used to be my uncle's, the one with the window that stuck halfway and the dresser that smelled faintly of cedar. At night I could hear the wind chimes and the refrigerator and her footsteps pacing, and those small, ordinary sounds kept me from slipping too far into the quiet. During the day, she made soup and insisted I eat, and when I said I wasn't hungry, she said that hunger doesn't get to decide everything. She called people. She wrote things down. She went out and came back with that particular look she got when she'd had to be polite to someone who didn't deserve it. I didn't go back to school right away. The counselor called and left a message that sounded like a paper boat trying to cross a lake. My friends sent texts that stacked up like unopened mail. The message from Leela stayed unread because I didn't trust myself to open it and not break something important, like the last thin thread I still had tied to who I used to be. Grandma said time was a tool, not a cure, and that we were going to use it, not let it use us. On the third day, she came home with a folder and set it on the table between the salt and pepper. She didn't open it right away. She poured tea and let it steam. Then she said, "I talked to the officer who took my statement. They're checking the camera at the corner store." She watched my face like she was measuring weather. I nodded and tried to keep my hope from showing too much because hope, when it falls, leaves bruises. The phone rang an hour later. Grandma answered and said very little. When she hung up, she said the store's camera was pointed the wrong way, that it caught the light but not the car, that sometimes truth has to take a longer road. She said we would keep walking it. My parents didn't call. That absence was louder than anything else. I kept thinking about my mother's shoes pointed at the door, the way my father's eyes had searched the floor like he'd lost something and decided not to look very hard. I kept thinking about how Leela's voice had found the shape of their doubt like water finds a crack. A week later, I went back to school with a note and a sweater that felt too big. People looked at me like I was a story they weren't sure they were allowed to ask about. In the hallway, a girl I barely knew said she was sorry, and I didn't know what she was sorry for exactly, but I said thank you, because that's what you say when someone hands you a small, careful thing. In chemistry, the teacher asked if I was okay, and I said yes because it was easier than explaining the size of no. Leva didn't come to school. Someone said she was taking time. Someone else said she was brave. The words floated around me like dust, and I breathed them in and felt them settle in places I couldn't reach. That night, Grandma and I sat at the kitchen table with a stack of old photos, not because we needed to see them, but because she said sometimes you remind yourself who you are by remembering who you've been. There was one of Leela and me with popsicles, our mouths stained red, her arm around my shoulders like we were a matched set. I touched the edge of it and felt something like grief for a thing that hadn't died but wasn't alive in the same way anymore. The police called 2 days after that. They said they'd talked to the friend Leela claimed she was meeting. They said the times didn't line up. They said they were going to ask more questions. Grandma said thank you and wrote the officer's name on the back of an envelope and underlined it twice. "We're not done," she told me, like she was telling the house. My parents called that evening. My mother's voice sounded like it was traveling through a tunnel. She asked how I was. I said I was fine because I didn't trust the word not to break. She said Leela was having a hard time. She said this was complicated. She said we'd talk soon. She didn't ask me what I remembered. She didn't ask me how I felt about being left. When the call ended, the dial tone felt like a door closing in a very polite way. The next day, I finally opened Leela's message. It was long and careful and full of words like misunderstanding and pressure and love. It said she didn't mean for it to get this big. It said our parents were scared. It said we could fix it together if I just told the same story. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred into lines and the lines into something like rain. I didn't reply. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I didn't know how to explain that some stories, once told, can't be untold, and some bridges don't burn with flames, just with quiet decisions. Grandma took me to the corner where the accident had happened. The asphalt still had a faint, pale scar where someone had cleaned something that didn't want to be cleaned. She pointed to where she'd been standing, to the lamppost with the sticker peeling, to the curb with the chip that looks like a heart if you tilt your head. She described the car, the way it slowed, the way it didn't. She said, "I know what I saw," and her voice didn't shake. A week later, the police came by the house. He sat at the table and took notes and asked me to tell him what I remembered, and I did, slowly, carefully, like I was walking across ice I didn't trust. He asked about Leela, he asked about our parents, he asked about the night and the rain and the phone call. When he left, he said they were going to bring Leela in again. Grandma stood at the door and watched his car until it turned the corner, like she was making sure it didn't forget us. School got quieter around me. People stop asking when they don't know what to do with answers. I started eating lunch in the library. I started writing things down that I didn't plan to show anyone. I wrote about the ceiling stain that looked like a bird and how birds don't ask permission to leave, they just go. And sometimes that's the only honest thing in a room. My parents didn't call again that week. I told myself it was because things were busy, because they were trying to be good parents to the child they could reach. That's the story I told myself when I needed sleep. The call came on a Thursday. Grandma answered and put it on speaker without asking me. The officer said they had more questions for Leela. He said there were inconsistencies. He said the friend had changed their statement. He said the car's data told a different story than the one Leela had told. He didn't say the word lie, but it was there, sitting between us like a chair no one wanted to take. That night, my mother showed up at the door alone. She looked smaller, like the world had taken a careful bite out of her. She didn't come in at first. She stood on the porch and said my name like she was checking if it still fit. Grandma stepped aside, and my mother came in and sat and cried in a way that felt new, not like the tears you perform when you're scared of consequences, but like the ones that come when something inside you finally breaks its promise to hold. She said she didn't know what to believe. She said she was tired. She said Leela always needed more. She said she was sorry. She didn't say sorry for leaving me in a hospital bed. She didn't say sorry for not asking. She said sorry like a word you set down and hope it becomes a bridge. I told her what Grandma had seen. I told her what the officer had said. I told her about the message I didn't answer. My mother listened and nodded and cried and said she needed time. Time again, like it was a room you could lock yourself in and come out changed. When she left, Grandma made us toast even though it was late. She said, "People don't change in a moment, but sometimes moments give them no place to hide." I didn't know if that was hopeful or just accurate. The next week, Leela came to school. She didn't look at me. In the hallway, I heard someone say her name like a question. In math, she asked to go to the bathroom and didn't come back. After school, my father called and said the police had asked Leela to come in again. He said they were just clearing things up. He said we should all be gentle. I said okay and meant nothing by it. 2 days later, Grandma and I sat in the living room and watched the late news with the sound off. The phone rang, and this time it was my father. He said Leela had admitted she'd been driving. He said she was scared. He said he didn't know how this happened. He said he was sorry. The word landed heavier this time, like it had finally found the right address. After we hung up, Grandma didn't say anything. She stood up and went to the porch and let the wind chimes talk. I sat on the couch and tried to feel something that wasn't either too big or too small. Relief came, but it didn't look like I'd imagined. It looked like a room you'd cleaned after a storm and realized the walls were still damp. The school counselor asked if I wanted to talk. I said maybe. My mother texted and said we should meet. I said okay. Leela sent another message that was shorter. It said she was sorry. I didn't reply. Not yet. If you think the truth feels like a door swinging open, sometimes it does. Sometimes it feels like a window you've been leaning against, and when it opens, you fall because you didn't know how much of your weight it was holding. We were getting closer to something. I could feel it in the way the house got quieter before a storm, in the way Grandma wrote lists and then crossed things off, in the way my parents' voices sounded like they were carrying glass. I didn't know what the something would be, only that it would ask me to decide who I was when everyone else stopped deciding for me. The meeting with my parents happened at a cafe that smelled like burnt coffee and optimism. It was neutral ground, my mother said, like we were diplomats instead of a family that had misplaced its own language. Grandma walked me to the door and squeezed my shoulder and said she'd be a block away if I needed her, which was her way of saying she trusted me but not the weather. Inside, my father was already there, stirring sugar into a cup he wasn't drinking. My mother stood when she saw me and then seemed to remember she didn't know how to stand in this story anymore, so she sat back down and folded her hands like they might float away. They asked how I was, and I said fine, and we all pretended that word was a bridge instead of a plank. My father talked about work, my mother talked about traffic, then the silence did what silence always does and started saying everything at once. My mother finally said Leela was at home, that she was sleeping a lot, that she was meeting with a lawyer because someone had told her to, that the police had been kind but firm. My father said we needed to stick together. He said families don't survive by pulling apart. He said he was proud of me for being strong, which is a compliment that can feel like a weight if you're not careful. I told them about the hospital. I told them how the room had smelled and how the ceiling stain looked like a bird and how I kept waiting for their footsteps. I told them I'd believe them when they said they'd come back. My mother's eyes filled and my father's jaw tightened like he was trying to hold something in place with his teeth. My mother said she hadn't known what to do. My father said he thought Leela needed them more in that moment. I said I didn't know we were doing a competition. They both flinched, and I felt bad for a second, which made me angry at myself because sometimes the truth needs teeth. My mother reached for my hand and then stopped halfway like she'd run into a pane of glass she couldn't see. She said she was sorry for leaving me. She said she was sorry for not asking me first. She said she didn't recognize herself in that choice. I believed her and also didn't, which is a complicated place to stand. We talked for an hour, and it felt like 10 minutes and a year. They asked if I'd come home. I said I didn't know. My father said we could take it slow. My mother said she'd drive me to school if I wanted. I said I'd think about it. When we stood to leave, my father hugged me in a way that felt like he was trying to memorize the shape of my back. My mother kissed my hair like she used to when I was small, and for a moment I almost said yes to everything because muscle memory is persuasive. Outside, the sky had decided to be kind, and I walked to the corner where Grandma said she'd be, and there she was, pretending to read a menu taped to a window. She didn't ask what they'd said. She just said, "You hungry?" And I realized I was, in ways that had nothing to do with food. At home, there was a message on the machine from the school counselor, and Grandma played it while she made soup. The counselor's voice was calm and practiced and said she wanted to check in. Grandma said we'd call her back. Then the phone rang again, and this time it was Leela. I let it ring until Grandma looked at me and said, "You get to choose," which is a sentence that can feel like a gift or a dare. I answered. Leela's voice was small, not the spotlight voice, not the room-filling laugh, but something like a draft under a door. She said she was sorry. She said she'd been scared and that things had gotten out of hand and that she hadn't known how to stop once she started. She said she loved me. She said she didn't mean to hurt me. I listened and watched a dust mote fall through a beam of light like it was performing a private slow dance. I told her I believed she was scared. I told her I believed she loved me in the way people sometimes love when they don't know how to protect what they love. I told her that what she did still happened. There was a long quiet. She said she didn't expect forgiveness. She said she wanted to try to make it right. I said making it right is a direction, not a place. When we hung up, my hands were shaking like they'd run a mile without me. The counselor's office had chairs that felt too soft and a plant that looked like it was trying very hard. She asked how I was sleeping. She asked what I was afraid of. She asked what I wanted. I said I wanted to not feel like a rumor in my own life. She nodded like that made sense. She said feelings don't line up in tidy rows. She said we'd work on giving them some room. The police called again. This time they wanted me to come in and give a statement, not because they didn't believe me, the officer said, but because they wanted the record to have my voice in it. Grandma came with me and sat in the waiting room with a book she didn't read. In the small office, I told the story again, slower, steadier, like I was laying stones in a river. The officer thanked me and said they were almost done. Almost is a word that makes you lean forward. At school, the whispering shifted. It always does. People recalibrate their stories when new facts arrive. Some said Leela was brave for admitting it. Some said I was lucky to have a grandmother like mine. A boy in my history class said his cousin had lied once and it ruined Thanksgiving forever, like that was a universal unit of measurement. I started eating lunch in the library again because the library doesn't care about your narrative arc. One afternoon, my mother picked me up from school because my bus was late and Grandma was at an appointment. The ride was quiet in a way that didn't feel like punishment, more like caution. At a stoplight, she said she was trying to do better. She said she was reading things about listening. She said she was sorry again, and this time she said it for the hospital, for the not asking, for the way she'd chosen the louder story instead of the truest. I said thank you and meant it, and also didn't know what came next. We drove past our old house, and I felt a tug like someone had tied a string to my ribs. She asked if I wanted to come in and get anything. I said, not today. She nodded like she was practicing being okay with that. The letter from the district attorney came in a plain envelope. It said there would be no charges against me, which felt strange because I hadn't been charged, but I understood the shape of the relief. It said Leela would face consequences appropriate to the situation. It said words like restitution and probation and counseling. It said things that sounded like scaffolding around a building that had lost a wall. Leela texted and said she'd be starting therapy. She said she was sorry again. She said she hoped someday we could talk without it hurting so much. I didn't reply right away. I took a walk to the corner with the peeling sticker and the heart-shaped chip in the curb. I stood where Grandma had stood and tried to imagine the moment as she'd seen it, the way the world narrows to a single detail when you're about to become a witness. I thought about how witnesses don't get to choose what they carry, only how they carry it. That night, Grandma and I made dinner together. She chopped onions with the kind of focus that suggests they've offended her personally. I set the table and realized I was humming. It surprised me. She noticed and said nothing, which is one of the ways she shows respect. A week later, my father came by with a box of my things from my room. He put it on the porch like he wasn't sure he'd been invited into the house. We sat on the steps and he told me about work and about the dog down the street that kept escaping. He said Leela was quieter. He said my mother was trying. He said he was trying too. He said he hoped I'd come home someday, and he said it without urgency, which made it sound more honest. I went through the box that night. There were notebooks and a sweater I thought I'd lost and a photo of Leela and me with popsicles. I put the photo back in the box and slid it under the bed, not because I wanted to forget it, but because I didn't want it to be the only thing that proved we'd been something once. The counselor said progress isn't a straight line. Grandma said neither is a good pie crust, and both need patience. I started sleeping better. I started answering some messages. I started believing that my voice had a place it could stand without borrowing strength from someone else. When the court date came for Leela, I didn't go. Grandma asked if I wanted to. I said no. She said that was okay. My parents went. They called afterward and said it was hard and necessary and not the end. My mother cried on the phone and said she was proud of me. My father said he was sorry again. I said I knew. The weeks kept stacking like that, small steps, ordinary days, the kind of quiet that isn't empty but isn't loud either. One afternoon, Leela showed up at Grandma's door without calling. She stood there with her hands in her pockets like she didn't know what to do with them. Grandma asked if I wanted to see her. I said yes, and then felt my stomach drop like I'd said something brave before I knew how. We sat at the kitchen table. Leela talked, I listened. I talked, she listened. We didn't fix anything, we didn't try to. We just named things and let them exist. When she left, the house felt like it had exhaled. I don't know when I decided to move back home. It wasn't a moment, it was more like the way you realize a season has changed because you don't need a jacket anymore. I started staying over on weekends. I started leaving a toothbrush in the cup. I started noticing that my mother asked questions and waited for answers, that my father looked up when I spoke. It didn't erase the hospital. It didn't need to. Grandma said she was proud of me. I said I was proud of her too. She said she'd only done what anyone should. I said not everyone does. Sometimes, late at night, I still see the ceiling stain that looks like a bird. It's faded now in my memory, but the shape is there. Birds leave. Sometimes they come back. Sometimes they teach you how to stand on your own branch. We weren't done. I could feel it. There was still a last door to open, a last room to walk through. I didn't know what would be in it. I only knew I wasn't going to walk there alone. Moving back into my parents' house didn't happen all at once. It happened in small, careful gestures, like leaving a sweater on the back of a chair and not taking it with me when Grandma picked me up, like keeping a pair of shoes by the door and pretending they were just visiting. The house looked the same, but houses have moods, and this one had learned a new one. My mother moved quieter, as if sound might bruise something. My father asked questions and waited, really waited, for the answers, even when the answers took their time finding their shoes. The first night I stayed, I slept in my old room with the window cracked because the air felt different. I woke up before my alarm and lay there listening to the house settle. In the morning, my mother knocked before coming in, like I was a guest. She asked if I wanted eggs or oatmeal. I said eggs. She made them the way I like, a little too soft, and didn't comment on how much I ate or didn't eat. We sat at the table and talked about nothing that mattered and everything that did. At school, the counselor said it sounded like I was building something. I said it felt more like I was repairing something that had never been built to handle storms. She said that counts. She gave me a worksheet about boundaries that I put in my backpack and forgot until it crumpled into a shape that looked like a small white bird. I almost laughed when I found it later because the world has a sense of humor even when you don't ask it to. Lila and I started meeting once a week at a coffee shop that didn't try too hard. We didn't sit in the corner and we didn't sit by the window. We sat in the middle like we were practicing being ordinary. Sometimes we talked about the case, about therapy, about the way consequences echo. Sometimes we talked about shows we used to watch and how the characters had done things we'd never forgive in real life, but somehow kept rooting for anyway. Sometimes we didn't talk much at all, and that was okay too. Trust doesn't come back with fireworks. It comes back with chairs that don't tip over when you lean. One afternoon, I came home to find my grandmother on our porch with a paper bag of groceries and that particular look she gets when she's pretending she's just in the neighborhood. My mother hugged her, and my father took the bag, and for a moment it felt like a photograph you don't know you're taking. We made soup together, and Grandma told a story about a woman she used to know who tried to keep peace by keeping secrets and ended up with neither. She didn't look at anyone when she said it, which made it land exactly where it needed to. Later, in my room, I found the photo of Lila and me with popsicles still under the bed. I took it out and set it on my desk. It didn't fix anything. It didn't need to. It just reminded me that time isn't a straight hallway. It's a house with rooms you can walk into again if you're willing to accept the dust. My father started coming to my track meets, standing a little too far back like he didn't want to crowd my air. When I finished a race, he'd give me a thumbs up instead of a lecture. My mother started leaving notes on the counter, small things like "good luck today" or "don't forget your lunch," written in a handwriting that looked like it had practiced being careful. I started answering them with sticky notes of my own. It was a quiet language, but it worked. The officer who had taken my statement called once more to say everything was settled on their end. He said he hoped we were doing okay. It was strange to hear a stranger use "we" about my family, but I appreciated it anyway. After I hung up, I sat on my bed and let the feeling arrive. It wasn't relief exactly. It was more like the moment after a storm when you realize you don't have to hold the door shut anymore. There was still anger in me, and there was still hurt, and sometimes they showed up unannounced and sat down like they owned the place. When that happened, I went for runs or wrote things down or sat with Grandma and listened to her talk about her garden like it was a small democracy that required patience and compromise. She said plants don't grow faster because you yell at them. I said families probably don't either. She smiled like she'd been waiting for me to say that. One Saturday, my parents asked if we could all go to dinner together, including Lila. The question hung in the air like a test balloon. I said yes because I wanted to know what it would feel like, not because I was sure it would be good. The restaurant was loud enough to cover our nerves. We talked about school and work and the menu. Lila kept her eyes on her plate until my mother asked her a question about a book she was reading, and then she looked up and answered, and for a moment it felt like we were four people sharing a table instead of four people sharing a history. On the way home, my father said he was proud of us. He meant it like he meant the work, not the image. I rolled down the window and let the air in and thought about how pride, when it's quiet, can be easier to carry. Not everything got better. Some days my mother still flinched when the phone rang. Some days Lila canceled our coffee because therapy had taken too much out of her. Some days I woke up with that old hollow feeling and had to remind myself where I was. Progress isn't a parade. It's a series of doors you remember to close gently. The end of the school year came with the usual noise and yearbook signatures that felt both too big and too small. A girl in my chemistry class wrote, "You're stronger than you think." I didn't know if she meant it or if it was something people write when they don't know what else to say, but I liked the way it looked on the page anyway. My counselor said she'd miss me and to come back if I ever needed to talk. I said thank you and meant it in a way that didn't expect anything in return. Grandma came to my track banquet and sat with my parents like it was the most natural thing in the world. When my name was called for a small and unimportant award, she clapped the loudest. My mother cried. My father pretended he had something in his eye. Lila smiled and didn't look away. I took the plaque and thought about the hospital room and the ceiling stain and how far a person can travel without moving very much. That summer, we painted the fence together. It was my father's idea, a way to make something look new without pretending it had always been that way. We got paint in our hair and on our shoes. Lila complained about the heat and then kept painting anyway. My mother put on music that nobody loved and everybody tolerated. Grandma sat in a lawn chair and told us we were doing it wrong and then brought lemonade. The fence didn't turn out perfect. It didn't need to. One evening, I found my mother in the kitchen with the light off, sitting at the table like she was waiting for a train that ran through memory. I sat with her. She said she still thought about the hospital. She said she still saw my bed and the way she turned toward the door. She said she wished she could carry that moment for me. I told her I didn't want her to carry it, not because I wanted to be alone with it, but because I didn't want it to decide who we were allowed to be next. She cried and I held her hand, and it felt like choosing something instead of just enduring it. Lila asked me one day if I'd ever trust her again. I told her trust isn't a switch, it's a series of small, boring choices that add up. She said she could do boring. I said good, because boring is where most of life happens. In August, Grandma's wind chimes broke in a storm. One of the strings snapped and the metal pieces fell like coins. We sat on her porch and fixed them together, threading a new line through the holes, listening to the way the sound changed. It wasn't the same, it was still music. She said, "See, things don't have to go back to be good." I nodded and thought about how many times I'd wanted back when what I needed was forward. School started again, and I took a heavier course load because I wanted to prove something to myself that didn't need proving. My parents worried. Grandma told them to let me try. Lila brought me coffee before my first big test and said no pressure, like she was joking and also like she wasn't. I did fine. Fine turned out to be enough. One night I dreamed about the ceiling stain again, but this time it didn't look like a bird, it looked like a window. When I woke up, I wrote that down and then went back to sleep, because sometimes understanding can wait until morning. We weren't healed. I don't think families ever are, not in the way people mean when they say that. We were mending. We were learning how to say the quiet things out loud and the loud things with care. We were learning that love isn't proved by how fast you choose, but by how long you stay when choosing is hard. There was one last conversation we hadn't had, one door we hadn't opened because we were all pretending the hallway ended there. I could feel it waiting, not like a threat, but like a question that doesn't go away just because you keep walking past it. I knew we'd have to answer it together, or it would keep asking. The conversation we kept walking past arrived on a Tuesday that felt like any other until it didn't. My mother asked if we could all sit down after dinner, and the way she said all made the word heavier than the rest of the sentence. We cleared the table and left the dishes like a small, visible promise we weren't planning to escape. Leela sat with her hands folded. My father leaned back like he was bracing for a wave. I sat where I could see the window because I wanted an exit that wasn't a door. My mother said she'd been thinking about what it meant that she left me in that hospital room. She said she'd been thinking about what it meant that she hadn't asked me a single question before deciding what was true. She said she didn't want that to be a story we carried like a quiet, poisonous heirloom. She looked at Leela and said she loved her, and then she looked at me and said she loved me too, and that those sentences were not supposed to compete. My father said he'd always believed that being a good parent meant choosing quickly when things were on fire. He said he'd chosen the loudest flame. He said he'd been wrong. He didn't try to make it smaller than it was, and I noticed that because I had started noticing things like that. Leela spoke last. She said she didn't want to be the person who taught our family how to break. She said she couldn't change what she'd done, but she could change what she did next. She said she'd keep going to therapy even when it was uncomfortable. She said she'd accept whatever distance I needed. She said she hoped someday we could be sisters again in a way that wasn't borrowed or forced. I told them the hospital still lived in me like a room I could walk into without meaning to. I told them sometimes I woke up there and had to remind myself where I was. I told them I didn't want to be careful forever, but I needed time not to be careful. I told them I didn't want to be chosen because someone else was louder. I wanted to be chosen because I was there. There were tears, but they weren't the kind that asked to be forgiven by existing. They were the kind that make room. We didn't solve everything. We didn't even try. We named the thing and agreed not to hide it in a drawer with a good silver. After that, something in the house changed. Not dramatically. It wasn't a movie moment. It was more like the way a room feels after you move a couch that's been blocking a window for years. The light was different. You still had to dust. I started running in the mornings before school, not because I needed to escape, but because I wanted to feel my lungs work and my legs remember their job. Sometimes Leela ran with me. We didn't talk much while we ran. We talked after, over water, about nothing important and a few things that were. My father started coming out on weekends and pretending he wasn't timing us. My mother made pancakes on Saturdays and burned the first batch because she always has. Grandma kept being Grandma, which is to say she showed up with a pie when nobody asked and left before anyone could make her do dishes. She asked me once if I was okay, and I said I was getting there, and she said that was a place worth visiting often. At school, I got a part in the fall play, a small role that required me to stand in a line and say a sentence like it mattered. On opening night, my family sat in the third row. I could see Grandma's hair like a small cloud. I could see my mother's hands folded in her lap like she was holding something fragile. When I said my line, my voice didn't shake. That surprised me more than applause. The counselor said I seemed steadier. I said I felt steadier. She said that didn't mean I wouldn't have bad days. I said I knew. We agreed bad days don't get to be evidence that nothing worked. Leela had her own bad days. There were mornings she didn't get out of bed, and afternoons she came home with her eyes red and said therapy had been hard. My mother learned how to make soup that didn't taste like apology. My father learned how to sit with quiet without trying to fix it with a screwdriver. One night, a letter came from the insurance company about the accident, a dense page of words that felt like a test written in another language. My parents read it at the cable. Leela sat in her room. I sat on the stairs and listened to the paper move. When my mother came to tell me what it said, she asked if I wanted to read it. I said no. She said okay. That was new. That felt like respect. The first time I went back to the hospital wasn't because I was sick, it was because a friend's sister had surgery and my friend asked me to come. I stood in the lobby and felt the floor tilt the way it used to. I thought about leaving. Then I thought about how many rooms I'd let that day own, and I stayed. We sat in the waiting area with the chairs that never quite face each other. I got a coffee that tasted like nothing. I breathed. When we left, the sky looked normal, which felt like a small miracle. Leela and I talked about it that night. She said she hadn't been back since the accident. I said she didn't have to go when she wasn't ready. She said she wanted to be ready. We made a plan that didn't have a date on it. In October, Grandma fell in her garden and scared all of us more than she meant to. She was fine, bruised and furious at the ground. We took turns bringing her groceries and pretending not to hover. One afternoon, she asked me to help her sort old papers. We found photos and letters and a receipt from a movie theater that no longer existed. She said, "People think stories end when the paper runs out. They don't. They end when you stop telling them." I asked her if she was worried. She said she was always a little worried and mostly grateful. The first real fight after everything happened over something small and stupid, like whose turn it was to take out the trash. Voices got sharp, doors got louder than they needed to be. I felt my chest tighten the way it used to. Then my father said, "We're not doing that," and sat down. My mother took a breath that looked like work. Leela said she was sorry. I said me too. We took out the trash. The world didn't end. That felt like progress. I wrote an essay for English class about witnesses and the way they carry what they see. I didn't name names. I didn't have to. My teacher wrote, "This is honest," at the top, and for once I didn't feel like that word was a dare. Sometimes I still check the ceiling in rooms for stains that looked like birds. I don't know why. Maybe it's how my brain marks exits. Maybe it's just a habit. Either way, it stopped meaning what it used to mean and started meaning something else, that I could notice a shape without falling into it. In November, we went to Grandma's for dinner, all of us, and it was loud and crowded and smelt like cinnamon. Leela helped in the kitchen and didn't get in the way. My father carved the turkey like he was negotiating a peace treaty. My mother told a story about me as a kid that I didn't remember but liked anyway. Grandma tapped her glass and said she was thankful for second drafts. We laughed because it sounded like a joke and because it wasn't. After dessert, Leela and I walked around the block. The air was cold and clean. She said she knew there were things I might never forget. I said forgetting wasn't the goal. She nodded. We stood under a streetlight and watched our breath make small clouds. She said she was proud of me. I said that made two of us. The winter came with its usual negotiations, snow days, late buses, the quiet that makes you notice your own thoughts. One evening, I found my mother looking at old photos on her phone. She said she was trying to remember what she'd been afraid of back then. I said maybe she didn't need to. She said maybe she needed to remember so she wouldn't build a house there again. We sat together and let the pictures go by. I got into a college I'd hoped for but didn't want to say out loud because hope can feel like tempting fate. When the letter came, I held it for a full minute before opening it, just to prove to myself that the world would wait. My parents cried. Grandma laughed and said she always knew I'd leave, and she didn't mean it like a goodbye. Leela hugged me and said she'd miss my shoes by the door. The night before I sent in my acceptance, I went for a run alone and stopped at the corner with the peeling sticker and the heart-shaped chip in the curb. I stood there and felt the cold in my lungs and thought about how many versions of myself had passed through this intersection without knowing it. I thought about my grandmother standing here, about the way a single pair of eyes can change a story's ending. I thought about how families are not a verdict, they're a practice. When I got home, my father was on the porch. He said he was proud of me again, and this time it didn't sound like a bandage. It sounded like a plan. We weren't perfect. We still aren't. We had learned how to talk, and that felt like the beginning of something that doesn't get headlines, but does get mornings. I could feel another ending approaching, not like a cliff, more like a bridge you don't see until you're already on it. There was one more thing to do before I left for college, one last room to walk through together, not because we owed it to the past, but because we owed it to the people we were becoming.
The last room turned out to be the hospital. Not the exact one, not the exact floor, but the idea of it, which is sometimes worse because ideas don't have exit signs. Leela brought it up first, one evening when the house smelled like burned toast and we were all pretending it was fine. She said she wanted to go back before I left for college. She said she didn't want that building to keep being a shadow we stepped around. My mother went quiet in a way that didn't feel like avoidance so much as preparation. My father nodded like he was agreeing to pick up something heavy. I said okay and felt my stomach argue with me and lose. We chose a Saturday. Grandma insisted on coming because she insists on coming to things that matter. She said she wouldn't come in if we didn't want her to. We said we did. The drive there was quiet in a way that felt intentional, like we were saving our voices for the place that would try to take them. The lobby hadn't changed. It still smelled like clean and worry. The floor still reflected faces you weren't sure you recognized. For a second, my legs forgot how to be legs. Then my father put his hand on the small of my back, not pushing, just present, and we walked. We found a bench near a window that showed a slice of sky, and we sat. No one knew what to say, which was honest. Leela broke the silence by saying she was scared. She said it like a confession and a fact. My mother said she was too. My father said he was proud of us for being there anyway. Grandma said, "Fear doesn't get to decide where we stand," and patted the bench like it was an old dog. We didn't go to the exact room. We walked the hallway and stopped where the numbers felt close enough. I closed my eyes and saw the ceiling stain again, and for the first time, it didn't pull me under. It was just a picture in a book I'd already read. I told them about it, about how I used to look at it like it was a map to somewhere else. My mother cried quietly and said she wished she'd been looking at me instead. I said we were all here now. It felt like setting something down. A nurse walked by and smiled in that professional way that says both welcome and keep moving. We kept moving. We got coffee from a machine that didn't care about our symbolism. We sat again and drank it. It tasted like nothing, and that was okay. When we left, the sky was still there, and it felt like a promise no one had written, but everyone understood. On the way home, Grandma told a story about the first time she'd gone back to a place that scared her. It involved a bridge and a stubborn friend and a pie that fell apart. The point, she said, was that you don't have to be brave the same way twice. We laughed, and the laughter didn't bounce off anything sharp. The weeks before I left were a blur of lists and boxes and the strange intimacy of deciding what version of yourself fits in a drawer. My mother helped me fold things I didn't want to admit I was sentimental about. My father found a lamp that had been in storage since before I was born and said it might be useful. Leela kept bringing me snacks and then eating them herself and saying she was stress eating on my behalf. We had one more dinner at Grandma's, the kind that pretends to be ordinary and then ambushes you with feeling. She gave me a small envelope with a note inside. It said, "For when rooms feel bigger than you." Inside was a photo of her porch with the wind chimes, taken on a day when the light looked like forgiveness. I hugged her and tried not to cry like a child, which is a silly goal because sometimes being a child is exactly right.
The night before I left, my parents sat on my bed like they used to when I was small and the world felt like a series of monsters that could be negotiated with. My mother said she was scared to let me go. My father said he was excited to see who I'd become. Leela sat on the floor and leaned against my knee. She said she was sorry again, not as a plea, not as a habit, but as a fact she wanted to keep true. I said I knew. We didn't promise anything dramatic. We promised to call. We promised to try. In the morning, the house felt like it was holding its breath. The car was packed. The sun did that thing it does when it pretends to be helpful. Grandma came and pretended she wasn't crying and then didn't pretend very well. The drive to campus took longer than it should have because every mile felt like a small argument between staying and going. When we arrived, the buildings looked like they'd been waiting a long time for a lot of stories and weren't picky about which ones showed up first. We carried boxes, we made jokes, we argued about where the bed should go. My mother straightened a poster like she was trying to straighten the world. My father tested the lamp and nodded. Leela sat on the window ledge and said she liked the light. When it was time for them to leave, my chest did the old thing where it tried to remember how to be empty. We hugged. We said things that didn't want to be last. Then they left and the hallway went back to being a hallway. The first night alone is always louder than you expect. The radiator talked like it had opinions. Someone down the hall laughed at something I didn't know. I lay on my bed and stared at a ceiling that didn't have a stain and felt a little disappointed and a little relieved. I texted Grandma a picture of the room. She sent back a heart and a reminder to eat something that wasn't beige. Classes started. I learned names. I learned roots. I learned that my voice sounded different in rooms where no one knew the old stories. That was both freeing and lonely, which is a combination I didn't know how to hold yet. I called home. My mother asked if I was sleeping. My father asked if the lamp worked. Leela asked if I'd found coffee that didn't taste like nothing. I told them yes, yes, and almost. One afternoon, I had to go to the campus clinic for a form. The waiting room had the same chairs that never quite face each other. My chest did the old thing again. I sat and breathed and looked at a poster about hand washing and waited for the world to tilt. It didn't. When my name was called, I stood up and walked like my legs remembered their job. After, I went outside and sat on a bench and laughed a little, not because it was funny, but because it was done. Leela started sending me pictures of the dog down the street that still escaped. Grandma sent me recipes I didn't make. My parents sent me articles about things I wasn't studying. It was their way of keeping a line open without tugging on it. On October 12th, I went home for a weekend. The house smelled the same. My room looked like a room that had learned how to wait. We went to dinner together. We argued about a movie. We laughed. It felt normal in a way that didn't erase the past, but didn't need to bow to it either. On Sunday, before I left, Grandma fixed the wind chimes again because one of the strings had slipped. We sat on the porch and listened to the sound change and change back. She said, "See, maintenance is love with a tool belt." On campus, I wrote more, not about the hospital, not about the lie, about other things, about roommates who left notes on the fridge and a professor who thought silence was a kind of answer, about how mornings have a way of being brave before you're ready. My counselor back home emailed to check in. I wrote back and said I was doing okay. I meant it in a way that didn't feel like a test. One night, Leela called and said she'd gone back to the corner with the peeling sticker and the heart-shaped chip in the curb. She said she'd stood there and said sorry to nobody and everybody. I said that sounded like the right audience. We were quiet together for a minute, and it felt like sharing a window instead of a wall. Winter came. Snow made the campus look like a story that pretends it's simple. I went to a party and left early. I stayed in and read. I learned that choosing what to keep is a skill you can practice. I learned that some rooms only look empty because you're standing in the doorway. When I came home for winter break, the house felt smaller in a good way, like a coat you've grown into. We put up decorations that didn't match. We ate too much. We argued about board games. One night, my mother and I washed dishes, and she said she still thought about that day. I said I did too. She said I'm glad we could say that without the floor disappearing. I said me too. On New Year's Eve, Grandma made a toast to second drafts and long sentences and the kind of quiet that lets you hear yourself. Leela raised her glass and said she was grateful for boring. My father laughed and said he'd never heard that one before. My mother said she was grateful for questions. I said I was grateful for witnesses. Back at school, the spring came with its own noise. I ran again, sometimes alone, sometimes with a friend who didn't know my map. I noticed that I didn't look for birds and ceiling stains anymore. I still noticed shapes, I just didn't need them to be exits. One afternoon, I got a call from Grandma. She said she'd planted something new in the garden and thought of me. She said it takes time to see what grows. I said I was learning that. We talked about the weather like people who know what the weather really means. I don't know when I stopped measuring time by that hospital hallway. It didn't happen in a ceremony. It happened in small, unremarkable minutes that stacked up and made a day. I still carry the story. I just don't carry it like a warning sign anymore. I carry it like a tool I know how to use. There's one last thing to tell you, not because it fixes everything, but because it tells you where we ended up standing when the music settled into something we could live with. The last thing to tell you begins in a way that feels ordinary, which is how most endings earn your trust before they ask you to believe them. It was a Tuesday, the kind with a sky that couldn't decide what it wanted, and I was back home for a long weekend because midterms had made everyone dramatic and because I missed the way Grandma's porch sounded when the wind didn't ask permission. The house was louder than it used to be, in a good way, with Leela playing music she pretended was background and my father pretending he didn't know the words. My mother was at the table with a stack of envelopes, the kind that looked like decisions. She asked if we could talk after dinner, and nobody flinched this time. That felt like a small, private victory. We cleared plates and left the dishes like always, a quiet agreement that some things could wait. We sat. The window was open a little, and the air moved like it was curious. My mother said she'd been offered a job in a city 2 hours away. She said it was a good opportunity, and she said she wasn't sure what she wanted to do. My father said he'd been thinking about it too, about whether change is a door or a mirror. Leela said she'd just started feeling steady and didn't want to move again. They all looked at me, not like I was the tiebreaker, but like they were trying to remember that my vote counted. I felt the old urge to say whatever would keep the room calm. I felt it like a habit tugging at my sleeve. Then I remembered the hospital and the ceiling stain and the way silence can become a decision if you let it. I said I didn't know what the right choice was for them, but I knew I didn't want to be left out of the conversation again. I said if we moved, I wanted to help decide how. I said if we stayed, I wanted it to be because we chose staying, not because we were afraid of packing. My mother nodded. My father said that made sense. Leela said she appreciated being asked. We didn't decide anything that night. We decided to keep deciding together. That felt like the point. The next morning, I went for a run and took the long way past the corner with the peeling sticker and the heart-shaped chip in the curb. It was just a corner now. That surprised me, even though I knew it shouldn't. I kept running and felt my breath find a rhythm that didn't need to argue with me. At breakfast, Grandma showed up with a loaf of bread, like she had sensed a conversation and brought a witness. She listened and said, "Whatever you choose, choose it like you're going to live there." My father said that sounded like advice from someone who had moved a lot. Grandma said it sounded like advice from someone who had stayed when it was easier to go. We laughed because both were true. That afternoon, Leela and I cleaned out the garage because that's what you do when you don't want to clean out your feelings yet. We found boxes of things that belonged to versions of us that didn't know this story. Old school projects, shoes that were too small, a lamp that still worked. Leela held up a box of her old auditions and said she didn't know whether to keep them. I said keep the ones that remind you why you started. She said she'd keep the ones that reminded her how much she'd learned. We compromised and kept both. Later, my father asked if I wanted to drive with him to pick up paint for the fence because apparently we'd decided fences were our metaphor now. In the car, he told me he still thought about the hospital too, about the way he'd chosen speed over sense. He said he was trying to be the kind of person who pauses now, even when the fire looks loud. I told him I'd noticed. He smiled like that mattered. That night, I sat on my bed in my old room and looked at the photo of Leela and me with popsicles that had moved from under the bed to the bookshelf, like it had earned a better view. I thought about how many times I'd tried to turn that picture into proof of something, proof we were fine, proof we weren't, proof we could be again. The truth is, pictures are just witnesses. They don't argue, they don't decide, they just keep showing up. The weekend passed with that kind of gentle suspense that feels like a held breath but isn't panic. On Sunday, before I drove back to campus, my parents said they were leaning towards staying, at least for now. My mother said the job would still be there later. My father said there were things he wanted to finish here. Leela looked relieved and tried not to look like she was counting it as a win. I said okay, and meant it like a promise to keep listening. Back at school, the semester found its way to the end the way it always does, with papers and finals and the strange, bright exhaustion that makes you want to clean your room and change your life at the same time. I turned in a story for my writing class that wasn't about the hospital and wasn't not about it either. The professor wrote, "You're learning how to choose where to look." I kept that comment like a small map. One afternoon, I went to the campus clinic again, not for me this time, but to walk a friend there because she didn't want to go alone. The waiting room still had the chairs that never quite face each other. My chest did a quiet check-in and then went back to its job. We sat and talked about a show we both liked. When her name was called, she squeezed my hand and went in. I stayed and scrolled through pictures of Grandma's garden she'd sent me. When we left, the sky did the normal thing again, and that felt like a bigger deal than it should. Leela started a new job at a cafe and sent me pictures of lattes with uneven hearts. My mother started a class she'd always talked about and never made time for. My father fixed the squeak in the stairs and pretended it wasn't a metaphor. Grandma's wind chimes held their tune through another storm. The world kept being both ordinary and unreasonably specific. Near the end of the semester, my parents came to campus for a small awards thing I didn't think mattered. They sat in the third row by habit. When my name was called, I stood up and walked like I didn't need to borrow anyone's legs. I spotted Grandma's hair like a small cloud because of course she had come. I waved, she waved back like she was trying to direct traffic. After we went to dinner, we argued about dessert, we took pictures we didn't know we'd keep. On the walk back to my dorm, my mother said she was proud of me in a way that didn't sound like a promise to fix anything. It sounded like a statement. I said thank you and didn't look for the nearest exit. The summer came with a job and a routine and the kind of days that don't announce themselves. I moved back home and then back to campus again for a class and then back home, practicing leaving and returning like they were both verbs I was allowed to use. The fence held its paint, the garage stayed mostly clean, the photo stayed on the shelf. One evening, we had a small party for no reason. Grandma brought pie, Leela brought a friend who laughed like she had never been asked to choose between stories. My father grilled something that required more attention than it deserved. My mother put on music and didn't apologize for it. We sat outside as the light changed and told stories that weren't about the hospital and weren't trying not to be either. At some point, Grandma said, "I'm glad I was there that day," and everyone went quiet in a way that didn't feel like a bruise. She said, not because it was hard, because it meant the truth had somewhere to stand. We nodded. Someone handed her a plate. The moment passed, which is what moments do when you let them. Later, when it was just me and Leela on the porch, she said she still wakes up sometimes with that old, sharp fear. I said, me too. She said she's learning to let it pass without building a house for it. I said that sounded like progress. We listened to the wind chimes until they decided to stop. A week before I went back to campus, I found the note Grandma had given me tucked into a book, for when rooms feel bigger than you. I thought about all the rooms that felt too big and how many of them were just rooms now. I put the note back and left the book open like it could breathe. On the drive back, my father asked me what I wanted to do after college. I said I didn't know and that I was trying to be okay with that. He said that sounded like a plan. My mother asked if I was eating enough. Leela asked if I'd send her my class schedule. Grandma asked if I'd come home soon. I said yes to everything that felt like a thread. The first night back, I lay on my bed and listened to the radiator argue with itself and thought about how the ceiling here still didn't have a stain. I didn't miss it. I didn't need it. I fell asleep without mapping exits. There are still days when I think about the hospital. There are still days when a hallway looks like a question. But most days, the world looks like series of small, workable choices. Most days, I choose to stay in the room I'm in and see what it asks for. I'm telling you this not because it's neat and not because it's finished, but because it's true in the way things are true when they keep moving. Families don't stop being stories, they just stop pretending there's only one version that counts. There is one more thing to say, the part that belongs at the end, not because it ties a bow, but because it tells you where we're standing now and why standing there feels like enough. I didn't realize how quiet a good ending can be until I started living inside one. Not the kind that closes a book with a click, but the kind that leaves the window open and trusts the night to do something sensible. The semester started like any other, with syllabi that pretended to be maps and coffee that pretended to be sleep. I walked the same paths, sat in the same seats, listened to the same radiator argue with itself, and it all felt different because I wasn't waiting for a ceiling to teach me how to breathe. The first real test came in a small, stupid way. My phone buzzed during class with my mother's name, and for half a second my chest did that old, sharp rehearsal. I let it buzz. After class, I called her back. She said she'd forgotten whether I preferred the blue sweater or the gray one and didn't want to send the wrong thing in a care package. I laughed and she laughed, and we decided to send both because life is rarely improved by narrowing choices when you don't have to. When we hung up, I noticed my hands weren't shaking. I kept noticing that. A week later, Leela sent me a video of her cafe's espresso machine making a noise like a small animal. She'd written, "It sounds like it's trying to tell me something." And I wrote back, "Maybe it's saying slow down." And she wrote, "Rude, but fair." We started trading small, ordinary pieces of our days like we were building a bridge out of receipts and jokes. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a repair. It was a practice. Midterms arrived, and I went home for a weekend because Grandma had asked if I could help her move some things in the garden. The wind chimes were quieter, like they'd learned to rest between storms. We moved pots and trimmed something that didn't need trimming. She made tea and didn't measure anything. At one point, she said, "You know, people think seeing everything makes you hard. It doesn't. It just makes you careful with where you put your hands." I said I was learning that too. She smiled like that was the only assignment that mattered. That night we all ate together, the way we do now, not as a ritual that asks for perfection, but as a habit that makes room. My father told a story about the fence that was mostly about how he'd painted himself into a corner. My mother told a story about her class and the way she'd been the oldest person in the room and the least afraid to ask a question. Leela told a story about a customer who asked for a latte with less coffee and how she tried to translate that into something kind. We laughed, we did the dishes, the sink leaked, and nobody made it a metaphor. The next morning, Grandma asked me to drive her to the library because her knees were feeling like they'd been invited to a long meeting without snacks. In the car, she told me about a woman she'd known who collected teacups and didn't drink tea. She said some people collect what they're afraid to use, others use what they're afraid to lose. I asked her which one she was. She said, "I collect stories and use them up." We sat in the parking lot a moment longer than necessary because sometimes that's the right length of time. Back at school, I turned in another story that wasn't about the hospital and wasn't not about it either. This one was about a bridge that kept being repaired while people walked across it. The professor wrote, "You're letting the reader stand where you're standing." I thought about how that's what Grandma had done for me and how I'd spent a long time learning to do it for myself. The holidays came and went like they always do, with the strange tenderness of being home and the strange relief of leaving again. We didn't make any big announcements. We didn't need to. My mother stayed at her job and kept her class. My father fixed a light in the hallway and didn't tell anyone about it. Leela auditioned for something small and didn't call it small. Grandma kept the chimes tuned to whatever weather showed up. There was a day in January when a friend from my dorm had a panic attack in the laundry room because the dryers sounded like sirens. We sat on the floor with our backs against the machines, and I told her to count the tiles with me. I told her it would pass, because sometimes you can say that without lying. Later, she said thank you like it was heavier than words usually are. I thought about the ceiling stain and how it had taught me the wrong lesson for a long time, and how I'd had to learn a better one in pieces. In the spring, my parents came up for a weekend, and we walked around campus like tourists who kept forgetting which building was which. My father asked too many questions. My mother took pictures of trees like she was making a case. Leela tried to find the best coffee and claimed victory when the barista recognized her from somewhere. We sat on a bench and watched people hurry with backpacks that looked like they were full of decisions. My mother said, "I'm glad you're here," in a way that didn't need a defense. I said, "Me too," and meant the whole sentence. That night in my dorm room, I showed them the comment from my professor and the bridge story and the photo of the popsicles that still lived on my shelf. My father said he remembered that day because he'd been worried about bees. My mother said she remembered because the freezer had been broken and she'd pretended it wasn't. Leela said she remembered because I'd let her have the last bite. We argued about whose memory was right and decided that all of them were. The picture stayed where it was. The end of the year came with the particular brightness that only shows up when you're tired and proud at the same time. I went home for the summer again, and this time it felt less like a return and more like a continuation. I took a job that paid just enough to make me think about what I wanted to buy and what I didn't. Leela got promoted and pretended it wasn't a big deal, and then told everyone. My mother finished her class and framed the certificate like it was a map. My father started teaching himself something on the internet and claimed he was just messing around, which is what people say when they're actually learning. One evening, we sat outside, and the wind chimes tried to start an argument with the quiet and failed. Grandma told a story about a neighbor who planted tomatoes too early and had to cover them with old sheets. She said, "Hope is a schedule. It doesn't always care what day it is." We watched the sky do the thing where it becomes more than one color at once. Someone asked if anyone wanted ice cream. Someone else said yes before the question finished. That felt like a small triumph. There were still moments when the old story tried to tell itself. A slammed door, a raised voice from a different house, a siren that wasn't for us. Each time I noticed it like you notice a cloud that looks like a shape and then doesn't. I didn't need to argue with it. I didn't need to chase it. I could let it pass and keep my place. In August, Grandma had a doctor's appointment that was supposed to be routine and decided to be dramatic instead. We sat in a waiting room that had magazines from a different decade and chairs that tried to be kind. The tests came back fine, and we laughed like people who had rehearsed the other ending. In the car, she said, "I don't mind endings. I mind when people pretend they don't exist." I said I was learning not to pretend. She said that was all she'd ever asked. On the drive home, my father took a wrong turn and discovered a street none of us had seen before. We drove it anyway. It had houses with porches and a bakery that smelled like permission. We stopped and brought bread and didn't regret it. Sometimes you don't need a map. Sometimes you just need a little time and a reason to keep going. When I went back to campus for my final year, I carried fewer things and more certainty. Not the kind that says it knows how everything ends, but the kind that says it knows how to stay in the room. My classes were harder, my coffee was worse, my stories were better. I started tutoring at the clinic on campus, not in medicine, but in listening, because apparently that's a thing you can do if you're careful and honest and don't try to be the hero. One afternoon, a girl sat across from me and said her family was breaking and she didn't know where to put her hands. I told her what Grandma had told me. I told her it was okay to be careful. I told her it was okay to use what she was afraid to lose. She nodded like she was taking notes without writing anything. When she left, I sat there a moment and felt the room just be a room. Near graduation, my parents came again, and this time Grandma wore a jacket like she was going to court. We sat in the same third row out of habit. When my name was called, I walked like I had practiced walking across bridges. I saw them and waved and didn't look for exits. After we took pictures and argued about frames, we went to dinner and ordered too much, the world did its ordinary, unreasonably specific thing. On the drive home, my mother asked what I wanted next. I said I had some ideas and some patience. My father said those were good tools. Leela said she wanted to visit and see my apartment when I had one. Grandma said she wanted to bring the chimes because they'd miss me. We laughed and decided they could stay and we could visit. That night, I lay in my bed and thought about the ceiling at the hospital and the ceiling in my dorm and the ceilings I hadn't met yet. I thought about how rooms can feel bigger than you and how notes can help, and sometimes you become your own note. I fell asleep without mapping exits and woke up without rehearsing apologies. Here's the part that belongs at the end, the part that doesn't try to close anything, but does tell you where we're standing. My parents did abandon me once, in the way people abandon without leaving the building. My sister did lie, in the way people lie when they're afraid of what the truth will cost. My grandmother saw everything, and she didn't use it like a weapon. She used it like a place to stand. We didn't fix the past. We learned how to live with it without letting it choose our furniture. We didn't become a better story. We became better at telling the one we're in. There are still days when hallways look like questions. There are still days when silence tries to decide for us. Most days, we decide back. If you take anything from this, take this. Rooms are just rooms until you decide to stay, and bridges are just bridges until you walk them. Truth doesn't make you brave, it gives you somewhere to put your hands. And family isn't the story you're handed, it's the one you keep writing, even when the ink runs, even when the paper remembers.